This is the story of a man who transformed himself from chattel to citizen, who used words as weapons against an entire system, and who forced a nation to confront the contradiction at its heart. It's a story about the power of literacy, the cost of freedom, and what it means to claim your humanity when an entire society insists you have none. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey entered the world around February 1818 on Maryland's eastern shore in Talbot County near Tuckahoe Creek. He would never know the exact date of his birth, a deprivation shared by countless enslaved people whose lives were not considered worthy of record. His mother was Harriet Bailey, an enslaved woman who belonged to Aaron Anthony. His father's identity remained uncertain throughout his life, though it was widely believed to be a white man, possibly Aaron Anthony himself. This was a common reality in slavery, where enslaved women had no protection from sexual violence, and where their children became property regardless of paternity. Douglass saw his mother perhaps 4 or 5 times in his entire life. Harriet Bailey was hired out on a plantation 12 miles away, and could only visit her son by walking those miles at night after a full day's labor, lying beside him for a few hours before walking back before dawn. She died when Frederick was around 7 years old. He would later write that he received news of her death with the same emotions one might feel upon hearing of a stranger's passing. The institution of slavery had stolen not just his freedom, but his chance to know his own mother. For his earliest years, Frederick lived with his grandmother Betsy Bailey and her husband Isaac Bailey, who was a free man on the outskirts of the Lloyd plantation. Betsy Bailey was a remarkable woman, skilled at fishing, farming, and weaving, and she raised several of her grandchildren while their mothers labored elsewhere. For young Frederick, these early years offered a brief respite from the full horrors of slavery. He was too young for field work, and his grandmother's cabin provided something approaching a normal childhood, at least by comparison to what was to come. That protection ended when Frederick was around 6 or 7 years old. One day, his grandmother took him by the hand and walked him 12 miles to Y House Plantation, home of Colonel Edward Lloyd, one of the wealthiest men in Maryland. Lloyd owned over 20 farms and hundreds of enslaved people. The plantation was a small empire with its own wheat fields, cattle, and manufacturing operations. Aaron Anthony, who owned Frederick, served as Lloyd's chief overseer and clerk, managing the extensive operations of this agricultural empire while owning enslaved people of his own. Frederick's grandmother brought him to the great house and then, without saying goodbye, simply left him there. It was his first taste of betrayal, his first understanding that in the world of slavery, relationships meant nothing when measured against the convenience of white people. He was alone among strangers, just another piece of property in Lloyd's vast holdings. On the Lloyd plantation, Frederick witnessed the brutality that defined the system. He saw his Aunt Hester stripped to the waist and whipped by Aaron Anthony until blood ran down her back. Her crime apparently nothing more than having been seen with a young man Anthony had forbidden her to see. The screams echoed through the house. Frederick, hiding and watching through a crack, later wrote that it was a scene that made his blood boil and his heart sicken. It was his introduction to the full horror of his condition. The overseers on Lloyd's plantation maintained control through terror. One overseer, a man named Sevier, earned his name through his cruelty. When he died, enslaved people openly rejoiced. Austin Gore, another overseer, shot an enslaved man named Demby in cold blood for the crime of refusing to take a whipping. Demby had run into a creek to escape the beating, and when he wouldn't come out, Gore counted to 3 and fired. No investigation followed. No charges were brought. The murder of an enslaved person barely warranted notice in Maryland's Talbot County. Frederick's life changed in 1826 when Aaron Anthony sent him to Baltimore, to the home of Hugh Auld and his wife Sophia. At around 8 years old, Frederick was to serve as a companion to the Aulds' young son Thomas. The move to Baltimore would prove transformative. Years later, Douglass would write that going to Baltimore laid the foundation for everything that followed, that it opened the gateway to his future. Sophia Auld initially treated Frederick with unexpected kindness. She had never owned enslaved people before, and didn't yet fully understand the rules of the system. She began teaching Frederick to read, starting with the alphabet alongside her son. For a brief time, learning seemed possible. Then Hugh Auld discovered what his wife was doing and exploded in fury. Teaching a slave to read was forbidden by law in Maryland, and Hugh Auld understood why. Standing in that Baltimore house, with young Frederick listening, Auld laid out the fundamental mechanism of slavery's control. Learning would spoil a slave, he declared. It would make him unfit for slavery. It would make him discontented and unhappy. Once you teach a slave to read, Auld said, there would be no keeping him. He would forever be unmanageable and of no value to his master. Frederick Douglass later wrote that this was the most valuable lesson he ever learned. In that moment, listening to Hugh Auld explain why literacy was dangerous, Frederick understood the pathway to freedom. If learning would make him unfit for slavery, then learning was exactly what he needed. Knowledge was the way out. Frederick taught himself to read. He carried a Webster's spelling book everywhere, trading bread from the Auld household to poor white children in exchange for reading lessons. When Hugh Auld sent him on errands, Frederick would leave early and pay these children in food for their time and knowledge. He practiced writing on board fences, brick walls, and pavements, copying letters wherever he could find them. He obtained a book called The Columbian Orator, which contained powerful speeches about liberty and freedom. He read and reread it, absorbing arguments about human rights and natural liberty, understanding for the first time that there were people in the world who believed slavery was wrong. The more Frederick read, the more he understood his condition. The knowledge was simultaneously liberating and tormenting. He could see the injustice of slavery with perfect clarity, but he was powerless to escape it. He later wrote that learning to read had been a curse as much as a blessing, that it had opened his eyes to the horrors of his bondage while offering no immediate way out. He sometimes envied his fellow enslaved people their ignorance, their inability to see the full weight of their chains. In 1832, after Aaron Anthony died, and his daughter Lucretia died shortly after, Frederick's ownership passed to Thomas Auld, Lucretia's husband, and Hugh Auld's brother. Thomas Auld ordered Frederick back from Baltimore to St. Michael's, a small town on Maryland's eastern shore. Frederick was now about 15 years old, a strong-willed teenager who had tasted the relative freedom of city life. Thomas Auld saw him as difficult and uppity, infected by too much time in Baltimore, where enslaved people had more latitude than on eastern shore farms. Thomas Auld was a man constantly trying to prove himself. He had married into slaveholding, not been born to it, and he seemed determined to establish his authority through cruelty. After experiencing religious conversion at a Methodist camp meeting, Auld became even worse. His newfound Christianity didn't soften his treatment of enslaved people. It gave him scriptural justification for violence. He would quote Bible verses while ordering whippings, finding in religion not a call to mercy but permission for brutality. Douglass would later write extensively about the particular hypocrisy of Christian slaveholders, noting that the cruelest masters he knew were the most devout. Thomas Auld deliberately starved his household, feeding his enslaved workers barely enough to survive. Frederick, a growing teenage boy, was constantly hungry. He stole food whenever possible, later arguing that it wasn't theft at all, since enslaved people were never paid for their labor and were entitled to sustenance. But Auld was done with what he saw as Frederick's insubordination. On January 1, 1834, Thomas Auld rented Frederick for 1 year to Edward Covey, a poor farmer with a reputation as a slave breaker. Covey had earned this title through systematic brutality. Slaveholders throughout the region sent their difficult enslaved workers to Covey to have their spirits crushed. Thomas Auld told Frederick explicitly that a year with Covey would break him of his troublesome ways. Covey's farm was on the Chesapeake Bay, about 7 miles from St. Michael's. Frederick walked there that bitter January morning with dread in his heart. He knew Covey's reputation. Within days, Frederick understood that the reputation was understated. Covey worked Frederick from before sunrise until after dark. He gave him unfamiliar tasks with inadequate instruction, then beat him savagely when mistakes occurred. On one of the coldest days that January, Covey sent Frederick into the woods to fetch a load of timber with a team of unbroken oxen. Frederick, who had never worked with oxen, lost control of them. The animals ran wild, destroyed the cart, and scattered the wood. When Frederick returned to report the disaster, Covey retrieved a rope and beat him with it until blood flowed freely and welts the size of fingers rose on his back. The wounds stayed open for weeks, kept raw by the coarse cloth of his shirt. This became the pattern. Covey beat Frederick regularly, often for no reason other than to maintain his reputation. He would hide in the bushes watching his workers, jumping out to catch them in any moment of rest. He created an atmosphere of constant surveillance and fear. Covey even locked an enslaved woman named Caroline with a hired man named Bill Smith each night, breeding them like livestock, celebrating when Caroline gave birth to twins. This professedly Christian man saw no contradiction between his religious devotion and treating human beings as breeding stock. For 6 months, Frederick endured this treatment. His spirit came close to breaking. He contemplated suicide. He contemplated killing Covey and hanging for it, seeing death as preferable to continued degradation. Standing on the Chesapeake shore, watching white sails on the water, he would address the ships in his mind, begging them to carry him to freedom, wondering why he should be a slave while they moved freely across the water. Then came the day in August 1834 that changed everything. Frederick, working in the hot sun, collapsed from exhaustion and heat. Covey found him lying on the ground, unable to rise. Rather than help him, Covey kicked him viciously in the side and struck him in the head with a hickory stick. When Frederick still couldn't get up, Covey beat him harder. Frederick managed to escape and walked 7 miles to St. Michael's, bleeding and desperate, to appeal to Thomas Auld for protection. Auld listened to his story and sent him back. There would be no rescue, no intervention. Frederick was on his own. When Frederick returned to Covey's farm, another enslaved man named Sandy Jenkins gave him a root, claiming it had supernatural properties that would protect him from beatings. Frederick didn't believe in the root's power, but he accepted it to avoid offending Sandy. What happened next had nothing to do with Roots, and everything to do with Frederick's decision that he would rather die than continue being beaten. When Covey attempted to tie Frederick up for another whipping, Frederick fought back. He grabbed Covey by the throat. When Covey called another man to help him, Frederick kicked that man down. For nearly 2 hours, Frederick and Covey struggled. Covey, accustomed to complete domination, couldn't subdue this 16-year-old who had decided to resist. Finally, Covey gave up, puffing and blowing, claiming that if Frederick hadn't resisted, the beating wouldn't have been so bad. But the truth, as Frederick knew, was that Covey hadn't beaten him at all. For the remaining 6 months of Frederick's time there, Covey never touched him again. Frederick Douglass would later write that this fight was the turning point of his life as a slave. It rekindled his desire for freedom, revived his sense of his own manhood, and proved that he would never again be a slave in fact, no matter what his legal status might be. The fight showed him that the power of slaveholders rested on the acquiescence of the enslaved, and that resistance was possible. After his year with Covey ended, Frederick was hired out to William Freeland, a farmer who at least didn't pretend to be religious or beat his workers constantly. At Freeland's farm, Frederick started a secret school, teaching fellow enslaved workers to read on Sundays using a battered copy of the Webster's Spelling Book. This was illegal, dangerous work. If discovered, they all could have been severely punished. But Frederick believed that knowledge was freedom, and he was determined to share what he had learned. At Freeland's farm, Frederick also began planning escape. Along with several other young men, he plotted to steal a canoe and paddle up the Chesapeake Bay to freedom in Pennsylvania. Frederick even forged passes, creating documents that claimed they had their master's permission to travel to Baltimore. The plan was detailed and might have worked, but someone betrayed them. In April 1836, Frederick and the other conspirators were arrested and jailed in Easton. Frederick fully expected to be sold to the Deep South, a fate worse than death for enslaved people in the Upper South. But Thomas Auld, perhaps recognizing that Frederick was too dangerous to keep in the countryside, sent him back to Baltimore instead. In Baltimore, Frederick learned the caulking trade in the shipyards, sealing the hulls of ships with tar. He became skilled at this work and was hired out to various employers, with most of his wages going to Hugh Auld. But Frederick had more freedom of movement than he'd ever had before, and he used it to attend meetings and debate societies in Baltimore's free black community. There, at the East Baltimore Mental Improvement Society, he met Anna Murray. Anna Murray was a free black woman, born to formerly enslaved parents in Caroline County, Maryland, just a month after they gained their freedom. She had moved to Baltimore at 17 and worked as a domestic servant for respectable families. She was literate, independent, and involved in the free black community's mutual aid societies. She was also 5 years older than Frederick, and understood the risks of helping an enslaved person escape. Frederick and Anna fell in love, and Anna agreed to help him gain his freedom. She had saved money from her years of domestic work, and she was willing to risk everything to help Frederick escape. Her involvement was crucial. Without her financial support and assistance, Frederick's escape might not have succeeded. On September 3, 1838, Frederick Bailey executed his plan. Anna had sewn him a sailor's uniform and had obtained papers from a retired black seaman. These were protection papers that proved the bearer was a free sailor, though the physical description on the document bore little resemblance to Frederick. Everything depended on conductors and ticket agents not examining the papers too closely, on the deference shown to sailors in a port city like Baltimore, and on Frederick's ability to project confidence while his heart pounded with fear. Frederick, dressed in the red shirt and sailor's hat, loosely knotted a black cravat around his neck and jumped onto a train just as it was pulling out of the station. He couldn't risk buying a ticket at the window where his papers might be scrutinized. He rode in the segregated car reserved for black passengers, trying to appear calm while terror coursed through him. When the conductor finally came to check papers, Frederick showed him the sailor's protection with the eagle emblem. The conductor barely glanced at it before moving on. Frederick had passed the first test. From Baltimore, the train took Frederick to Havre de Grace, Maryland. From there he took a ferry across the Susquehanna River to Perryville, continuing through Delaware toward the free state of Pennsylvania. At several points he encountered people who knew him, recognizing him despite his disguise. Each time he held his breath, waiting to be exposed. But no one spoke up. Perhaps they didn't want to get involved, or perhaps they understood what he was attempting and chose to let him pass. After less than 24 hours of travel, Frederick reached New York City on September 4th, 1838. He was free. He later wrote that he arrived with no money, no friends, no knowledge of how to survive in the city, but with an overwhelming sense of possibility. The butterflies in his stomach had been replaced by something like joy. But freedom brought its own dangers. As a fugitive, Frederick was still legally Thomas Auld's property. Slave catchers operated openly in New York City, kidnapping escaped slaves and free black people alike for profit. Frederick couldn't safely stay there long. Through the network of abolitionists and free black activists, he connected with David Ruggles, who ran a vigilance committee helping fugitives reach safety. Anna Murray arrived in New York 11 days after Frederick. On September 15, 1838, they were married by Reverend James W.C. Pennington, himself a fugitive slave from Maryland. The ceremony was brief, conducted in a small room, and then Frederick and Anna immediately left for New Bedford, Massachusetts, where they hoped to build a life. In New Bedford, Frederick adopted a new surname to make it harder for slave catchers to find him. A friend suggested Douglass, after a character in Sir Walter Scott's poem, The Lady of the Lake. Frederick Bailey became Frederick Douglass. New Bedford was a prosperous whaling town with a substantial free black community. Douglass found work as a laborer and caulker, though white workers threatened to strike if he worked alongside them at his skilled trade. He and Anna settled into a small house and started a family. Their first child, Rosetta, was born in 1839. Louis, Frederick Jr., Charles, and Annie would follow. Douglass subscribed to The Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper published in Boston. He devoured each issue, absorbing the arguments against slavery and for immediate abolition. In August 1841, Douglass attended an anti-slavery convention on Nantucket Island. William C. Coffin, a white abolitionist who had heard Douglass speak at a small meeting in New Bedford, invited him to address the crowd. Standing before nearly 1,000 people, most of them white, Frederick Douglass trembled with nervousness. He had escaped slavery just 3 years earlier. He was still legally a fugitive, vulnerable to capture and return. But when he began to speak, describing his life in bondage and his journey to freedom, the audience fell silent. His physical presence was commanding, his intellect obvious, his story devastating. When Douglass finished speaking, William Lloyd Garrison rose to address the crowd. "Have we been listening to a thing, a piece of property, or to a man?" Garrison demanded. "A man! A man!" the crowd roared back. "Shall such a man be held a slave in a Christian land?" "Never, never," came the reply. By the end of that evening, Douglass had been hired as a lecturer for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. His career as an abolitionist had begun. For the next 4 years, Douglass traveled throughout the northern states, speaking at anti-slavery meetings and conventions. He was part of the 100 Conventions campaign of 1843-1844, which brought abolitionists to Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. Douglass's speeches were powerful, combining detailed descriptions of slavery's brutality with sophisticated arguments about natural rights and human dignity. He also developed a talent for mimicry, mocking pro-slavery ministers and their justifications for human bondage. But Douglass faced skepticism. His eloquence and obvious education led some people to doubt that he had really been a slave. How could someone who spoke so brilliantly have been enslaved? The racism inherent in that question didn't occur to those asking it. To counter these doubts and to establish his credibility, Douglass decided to write his autobiography. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself, was published in May 1845. The book was an immediate sensation, selling thousands of copies and making Douglass famous far beyond abolitionist circles. The narrative was powerful for its specificity. Douglass named names: Aaron Anthony, Thomas Auld, Edward Covey, Hugh Auld, and described specific incidents of brutality and degradation. The book was undeniably authentic, written with such detail and power that it served as a devastating indictment of slavery. But the narrative's success created danger. By naming his former enslavers and revealing his identity, Douglass had made himself an easy target for slave catchers. Thomas Auld could show up with legal papers proving his ownership, and Douglass would have no legal recourse. Friends urged him to leave the country. In August 1845, Douglass sailed for Great Britain. He spent nearly 2 years touring England, Ireland, and Scotland, speaking to enthusiastic crowds about American slavery. British abolitionists were horrified by his stories and embraced him warmly. The contrast between his treatment in Britain and his treatment in America was stark. In Britain, Douglass could stay in any hotel, eat in any restaurant, and travel without restriction. No one questioned his humanity or his right to occupy space in the world. British admirers raised funds to purchase Douglass's freedom. In late 1846, Hugh Auld agreed to manumit Douglass in exchange for £150 sterling, about $701. On December 12, 1846, the manumission papers were filed in Baltimore. Frederick Douglass, at age 28, was legally free for the first time in his life. Douglass returned to America in 1847 with money raised by British supporters to start his own newspaper. William Lloyd Garrison opposed the idea, preferring that Douglass continue working as a lecturer for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. But Douglass was determined to have his own platform, to speak in his own voice without white gatekeepers determining what he could say. Douglass moved his family to Rochester, New York, and on December 3, 1847, published the first issue of the North Star. The name came from the star that guided escaping slaves northward. The newspaper's motto reflected Douglass's expanding vision. Right is of no sex. Truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren. The North Star, which later became Frederick Douglass's paper and then Douglass's Monthly, became one of the most influential black publications before the Civil War. The newspaper featured news about slavery and abolition, letters from readers, poetry, book reviews, and Douglass's powerful editorials. It reached over 4,000 subscribers across the United States, Europe, and the West Indies. Through the newspaper, Douglass maintained editorial independence, free to develop his own positions without deference to Garrison or anyone else. This independence led to a break with Garrison. Douglass came to disagree with Garrison's position that the Constitution was fundamentally pro-slavery, and that abolitionists should avoid political engagement. Douglass instead concluded that the Constitution, properly interpreted, could be used to abolish slavery, and that political action was necessary to achieve freedom. The split was bitter, with both men and their supporters exchanging harsh words. Douglass also became increasingly involved in other reform movements. In July 1848, he attended the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, and was the only man to support Elizabeth Cady Stanton's controversial resolution demanding voting rights for women. Douglass would remain a supporter of women's suffrage throughout his life, understanding that the fight for his own rights was connected to the fight for women's rights. His Rochester home became a station on the Underground Railroad. Douglass harbored escaped slaves, helping them reach Canada and freedom. He worked with Harriet Tubman, who led dozens of people out of bondage. In 1859, the radical abolitionist John Brown approached Douglass about his plan to raid the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to start a slave rebellion. Douglass met with Brown multiple times, but ultimately declined to participate, believing the plan was suicidal. After Brown's raid failed and Brown was executed, Douglass fled briefly to Canada and then to England, fearing he might be arrested as a co-conspirator. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 triggered the secession of Southern states and the beginning of the Civil War in April 1861. From the beginning, Douglass argued that the war must become a war to end slavery, not merely a war to preserve the Union. He pressed Lincoln relentlessly through speeches, editorials, and letters, demanding emancipation and the recruitment of black soldiers. Lincoln resisted at first, worried about losing the support of border states like Kentucky, and concerned that white soldiers wouldn't fight alongside black men. But, as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, Lincoln's position evolved. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in rebelling states were free. The proclamation also authorized the enlistment of black men in the Union Army. Douglass threw himself into recruitment. He traveled throughout the North, urging black men to enlist. His recruiting speeches were powerful. "Men of color to arms," he proclaimed. "This is our golden opportunity. Let us accept it, and forever wipe out the dark reproaches unsparingly hurled against us by our enemies. Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters, U.S., let him get an eagle on his button, and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket. There is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship." Two of Douglass's own sons, Lewis and Charles, enlisted in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first black regiments formed. Douglass saw military service as crucial not just for winning the war, but for proving black manhood and earning citizenship rights. If black men fought and bled for the country, he argued, the country would have to acknowledge them as citizens. But Douglass discovered that black soldiers faced discrimination. They were paid less than white soldiers, $10 a month instead of $13. They weren't allowed to become officers. When captured, they faced execution or re-enslavement rather than treatment as prisoners of war. In August 1863, Douglass visited President Lincoln at the White House to protest these injustices. The meeting was remarkable. Douglass had expected to wait for hours in an anteroom, as was typical for visitors to see the president. Instead, he was shown into Lincoln's office almost immediately. Lincoln greeted him warmly, called him Mr. Douglass, and listened to his concerns about the treatment of black soldiers. Though Lincoln didn't immediately solve all the problems Douglass raised, he treated Douglass with genuine respect, as an equal. No condescension, no paternalism. Just one man talking to another about matters of state. Douglass met with Lincoln again in 1864, when Lincoln feared he might lose re-election and wanted advice on how to get more enslaved people to escape to Union lines before a potential Democratic victory could reverse emancipation. Douglass, who had initially been skeptical of Lincoln's commitment to abolition, came to respect the president's political skill and moral evolution. When Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865, Douglass mourned him genuinely, recognizing that Lincoln had grown during his presidency and had ultimately done more for black freedom than any other white American leader. The end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865 ended slavery legally, but the fight for equality had only begun. During Reconstruction, Douglass continued advocating for black rights, particularly voting rights. "Slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot," he declared. When the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, guaranteeing voting rights regardless of race, Douglass saw it as a crucial victory, though he knew the battle was far from over. In 1872, Douglass's Rochester home burned down in a suspicious fire, destroying most of his papers and 16 volumes of his newspapers. The family moved to Washington, D.C., purchasing a house on Capitol Hill. In 1877, Douglass bought a larger estate called Cedar Hill in Anacostia, overlooking the capital city. The house had 15 acres and 21 rooms. It was a remarkable ascent for someone who had once slept on a dirt floor and fought dogs for food scraps. Douglass's later years brought both achievements and controversies. President Rutherford B. Hayes appointed him U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia in 1877, making him the first black person to hold the position. President James Garfield appointed him Recorder of Deeds for D.C. in 1881. In 1889, President Benjamin Harrison appointed him U.S. Minister Resident and Consul General to Haiti, the highest diplomatic post Douglass would hold. The Haiti appointment proved difficult. Douglass was 71 and found himself caught between representing American interests and his own sympathy for Haiti as the only black republic in the Western Hemisphere. When the Harrison administration wanted to pressure Haiti into leasing territory for a naval base, Douglass resented being used as a tool of American imperialism. He resigned in 1891, feeling that his appointment had been less about respect for his abilities and more about using his race as leverage with the Haitian government. Personal tragedy and controversy marked these years as well. In 1882, Anna Murray Douglass died after suffering a stroke. She had been Frederick's partner for 44 years, supporting him through his escape, his early poverty, his rise to prominence. She had managed their household while he traveled constantly, raised their 5 children, and endured his long absences. Their daughter Annie had died in 1860 at age 10, a loss that devastated both parents. In 1884, Douglass married Helen Pitts, his white former secretary who was 20 years his junior. The marriage shocked both white and black communities. Douglass's own children were hurt and angry. Helen's parents, though abolitionists, initially refused to speak to the couple. Critics accused Douglass of betraying his race by marrying a white woman. Douglass responded characteristically. His first wife had been the color of his mother, he said, and his second the color of his father. The couple traveled extensively through Europe and Egypt, and by most accounts had a happy marriage despite the social censure. Douglass continued speaking and writing until the end of his life. He published his third and final autobiography, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, in 1881, with a revised edition in 1892. He spoke at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, using the platform to protest racism and celebrate black progress. He remained active in the women's suffrage movement, continuing to fight for voting rights for women even after the 15th Amendment secured voting rights only for men. On February 20, 1895, Douglass attended a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington, D.C. He returned home to Cedar Hill that afternoon, intending to give another speech that evening. He was telling his wife Helen about the morning's meeting, apparently mimicking one of the speakers who had made a particularly passionate argument, when he suddenly clutched his chest and collapsed. He died minutes later from a massive heart attack. He was 77 years old. Douglass's funeral in Washington drew thousands of mourners. U.S. senators and Supreme Court justices served as pallbearers. After services in Washington, his body was transported to Rochester, where he had lived for 25 years, longer than anywhere else. He was buried next to Anna in Mount Hope Cemetery. Helen Pitts Douglass would be buried there as well when she died in 1903. The legacy of Frederick Douglass defies easy summary. He was the most photographed American of the 19th century, sitting for over 160 portraits because he believed that images of dignified, accomplished black men would help combat racist stereotypes. He was arguably the most important black leader of his century, using his voice and his pen to transform how America thought about race, slavery, and citizenship. But perhaps his most important contribution was simply insisting on being seen as fully human. Everything Douglass did, learning to read, fighting Edward Covey, escaping to freedom, becoming an orator, publishing newspapers, meeting with presidents, was an assertion that he was a man, not property, that he had the same natural rights as any other person, and that the color of his skin was irrelevant to his humanity. The boy who wore only a coarse shirt and stole food to survive became a man who dined with presidents and advised senators. The teenager who was beaten by Edward Covey lived to see slavery abolished in his lifetime. The fugitive who jumped on a moving train to escape bondage became a statesman who shaped American history. Frederick Douglass's life was an argument in flesh and blood against every claim that slavery's defenders made about the inherent inferiority of black people. His brilliance was undeniable, his courage remarkable, his impact immeasurable. He transformed himself from property to person, from slave to citizen, and in doing so helped transform a nation. In 1876, speaking at the dedication of the Freedmen's Memorial in Washington, D.C., with President Ulysses S. Grant in attendance, Douglass delivered a nuanced assessment of Abraham Lincoln that could serve as well as a description of Douglass himself. He spoke of a man who had risen from poverty and obscurity through force of will and moral conviction, who had learned and grown throughout his life, who had faced enormous challenges with courage and principle. Frederick Douglass spent his life insisting that America live up to its founding promises of freedom and equality. He knew those promises had been hollow for black Americans, that the 4th of July was a mockery when 4 million people remained enslaved, that the Constitution's claims about justice were lies when the law treated human beings as property. But he also believed that those promises could be made real, that America could be transformed, that the arc of history could be bent toward justice. His life was proof. The system that tried to break him had failed. The chains that bound him had been broken. The society that denied his humanity had been forced to acknowledge it. Frederick Douglass lived to see slavery end, to see the Constitution amended to recognize the citizenship of Black Americans, to see some progress toward the equality he had fought for his entire life. He knew the work was incomplete. The gains of Reconstruction were already being rolled back in his final years. Jim Crow laws were spreading across the South. Violence against Black Americans continued unchecked. The promises of the 15th Amendment were being systematically undermined. But Douglass had seen slavery itself abolished, a change that had seemed impossible in his youth. If that could happen, what else might be possible? Frederick Douglass was buried on a cold February day in Rochester, in the city where he had built his newspaper, raised his family, and helped countless people escape slavery through the Underground Railroad. Thousands attended his funeral. Schools closed. Flags flew at half-mast. Black and white Americans alike mourned the passing of a man who had devoted his life to making his country live up to its ideals. His grave, next to Anna's, remains one of the most visited in Mount Hope Cemetery. The marker describes him simply: escaped slave, abolitionist, suffragist, journalist, and statesman, founder of the civil rights movement in America. It's an accurate summary, but it doesn't capture the full measure of the man. Frederick Douglass showed that one voice, raised in truth and justice, could shake the foundations of an unjust system. He showed that words could be weapons against oppression, that moral courage could challenge immoral institutions, and that change, however impossible it might seem, was achievable if people were willing to fight for it. The boy who learned to read by trading bread for lessons became a man whose words changed history. The slave who was supposed to be broken instead broke his chains. Frederick Douglass spent 20 years in bondage, and the rest of his life proving that no one, no matter how many laws insisted otherwise, could ever truly own another human being.